And the topic is Edgar Cayce and conflict resolution. And as John said, I've been a student of the Cayce readings for a long time. I first encountered them when I was a preteen, and they came at a time in my life when it was really a challenging time for me, I guess. And I really felt that it was a life-saving information for me. And I just feel that it answers life's big questions about who we are and why we're here and why things happen. And I have also found I found early on that my passion was, and my plan in life was to go to law school. And so it's been a passion of mine as well to help people to understand how laws work and how we choose to govern ourselves and how we can help people through the practice of law. So that's it's delightful for me to be able to find the place where those two passions intersect. And that's what we'll be talking about today. As John mentioned, I'm here in Seattle, Washington, and I am a practicing attorney and also have had a chance to give presentations about the things that have mattered to me about the case, some of the things in the Cayce materials. And I hope that this topic will be of value to you and to people who you might be able to share it with as well. This is what we'll be talking about today. I wanted to go over the sort of the places that conflict happens in our lives and talk about conflicts that were experienced by Edgar Cayce in his life. There certainly were plenty of conflicts that came his way, and we'll talk about some of the big ones, particularly because I have an interest in it. Cases and circumstances where he was involved with the law in lawsuits or the criminal justice system. And then talk about some myths and truths about conflict and conflict resolution. We'll talk about building our conflict resolution toolbox and some things that the Cayce reading said about that, and some of the tips that I can share with you from my practice of law about conflict resolution. And then talk about how we can use those tools in different contexts in our life. Talk about some things from Jesus and other wisdom teachings about conflict resolution as well. And then wrap up with some of the stories, not only about the conflicts in Edgar Cayce's life, but also some of the resolution stories in his life and how some of those stories wrapped up for him and how they did. So I hope that gives you a little roadmap of where we'll be going today. The first question I have for you today actually is to talk about where, I'm just trying to get the screen to forward here. Let me see if I can move it on. But what I would appreciate if you would all just sort of drop into the chat maybe one word or a little phrase about something. When you think about the concept of conflict and conflict resolution, where is an occasion where it's been the most pressing interpersonal conflict that's happening in your life right now, or one that seems to matter most to you right now? And see what, just if you could drop something in the chat, I'd appreciate seeing it, because I think it would help me sort of define if we look at some examples and things, it'll help us to did get a chance to take a look at some of your comments in the chat, which I really appreciated. And it's great to see, these are the kinds of things that I think that we do see in conflict in our lives. We see things in families, whether it's with our spouse or with parents or children, with school or work, things involving money, things involving neighbors, things involving property. Sometimes we're involved in lawsuits. I saw a couple of people mention divorce and other family issues in their list of conflicts that are in their lives right now. Sometimes it's discrimination. Sometimes it's dealing with government agencies or government officials that you're having to deal with a zoning issue or some other permitting issue, something more significant related to your work or business. Sometimes it's things that we're involved with politics or activism. Sometimes it's sexual, physical conflicts that we're in, or about bullying or harassment at the school or at work. Sometimes it's actual physical violence that we're dealing with, whether it's in domestic settings or in other settings. So these are all these are big issues, and these are big things that come into our lives and things that make a big difference in our life and can really be the highest priority thing that we're thinking about right now. So I think that as we think about conflicts, I think it's helpful to just sort of put some framing around it and talk about what things how this conflict plays a role in our life. How does it make you feel? What are the emotions that you associate with this conflict? What does winning look like? What do you really want out of it? What's the end goal for you, and why do you want it? What sounds like it would be a success for you? What does the other person want? Whoever's involved in the conflict with you, what do they want, and why do they want it? Who has more power in the conflict, and what are the sources of that power? And what does losing look like, and who defined losing and why? How did that definition come into your life as what losing would look like? These are some of the things that we can think about. Well, I think that in in my research of the Edgar Cayce materials and in the research about his life, I think that these are some of the biggest issues that I've seen in his life that came up for him. We'll talk about his father, Leslie B. Cayce, who somewhere along the way had the nickname added to him, the Squire. So we might refer to him as that. But then there was an important lawsuit that Edgar Cayce was involved in Hopkinsville in his early years that really sort of changed the trajectory of his life and led him to leave Hopkinsville. And then he was involved in litigation you may have heard about if you know any of the Edgar Cayce story about after they closed the hospital, there was litigation with the partners who had invested in the hospital, and then he was arrested twice. He had run-ins twice with the criminal justice system, and it was life-changing, very impactful circumstances in his life both times it happened. The first conflict we'll talk about is his conflict with his father. He was the Squire. You can see him in this picture here, and he's just, you can see that there's a chip on his shoulder, I think, just from the picture of him. And this is a photograph that Edgar Cayce took of the two of them together. But you can sort of see just from the framing of this photograph, Edgar Cayce was a prize-winning photographer. He showed a lot of artistry in his work, but if there's anything that you see out of this picture, it's that Edgar Cayce was living in the shadow of his father. He put himself intentionally in the background of this photograph, and he was living his life and looking at the camera through the experiences that he had with his father. This is a quote from Hugh Lynn Cayce, Edgar Cayce's son. He said that the Squire, Hugh Lynn's grandfather, showed one of the strongest drives from which emotional hatred comes. He, as the more I've read about the Squire and his life, I just feel like if there was ever a prototype for Darth Vader, it was probably him. He was a violent man. He was alcoholic. He was, this is another quote about him. There was scarcely a bone in his body that hasn't been broken at some time or another. He was, involved in constant, whether it was barroom brawls or all sorts of other things. He was quite a violent man. He, Sid Kirkpatrick, who's one of the best Edgar Cayce researchers there is, has speculated and suggested that Edgar Cayce had two siblings who died at a very young age, and he said, the amount of violence that that the Squire was involved in, it's been suggested that the cause of those two Edgar Cayce siblings' deaths might have been related to this very violent personality. It was at that level. But this is another quote about the Squire. It says his early manhood and middle life had been spent in great dissipation, which in that day meant alcoholism, or destroying his life with alcohol, and misuse of his body and his financial substance. So in addition to being a violent personality, he was also someone who just was very bad at managing money, to the point where the Squire's own mother gave her inheritance, in her will, she specified portions of the will of her property went to all the other children, but the Squire's portion of the property went to the Squire's wife instead of him, because he just was that bad at managing money. And he was also a racist. He was a white supremacist. He was had very strong and violent opinions about white supremacy, and Edgar Cayce very strongly didn't agree with those opinions. And Hugh Lynn commented in his memoir, he said the Squire and my father Edgar would have long involved arguments over the racial questions. So this was a presence in Edgar Cayce's life for quite a while. And I just I went through and just wanted to share with you, it wasn't just something that was Edgar Cayce's was dealing with in his childhood. They did live together, of course, until Edgar Cayce was 17, but then they lived together again, and when they were both living in Hopkinsville. So until Edgar Cayce married, they were in each other's lives most of the time. And then he moved away, but then he moved back to Hopkinsville. In these years, they were again together. And then after Edgar Cayce moved to Selma, the Squire moved for quite a bit of that time as well. And then after Edgar Cayce moved to Virginia Beach, nearly 10 years, the Squire was living with them until very close to the Squire's passing. So this was a huge presence in Edgar Cayce's life, and he had to deal with this very man who spewed hate and was, caused conflict wherever he went. So this was a big part of Edgar Cayce's life as well. I mentioned that there was a lawsuit that Edgar Cayce was involved in when he was living in Hopkinsville. He had moved to Alabama for a while to take a job with a photographer, and then he was the subject of a New York Times article about his work in late October 1910, and then there was so much response, bags of mail about interest in the work and so forth, that he decided to move back to Hopkinsville and give a try to make his life work, make this be his daily work as well as something that he did outside of his photography business. So he made this partnership with one of the richest men in town in Hopkinsville, this man A.D. Noe, who owned the biggest hotel in town, and they had a partnership that the Noe would supply the financial wherewithal for the business and provide the place for Edgar Cayce to do his readings and provide a stenographer, and then they would share the proceeds of the business. And Edgar Cayce's father, the Squire, was his business manager. For this, he became very proud of Edgar Cayce after he was featured in the New York Times. And so anyway, things did not go well with this new business partnership. It started in late 1910, and 1911 turned out to be a very bad year because Edgar Cayce's son Milton Porter was born, but then died 6 weeks later of illness. And then Gertrude, in grieving, became very sick as well and nearly died of tuberculosis. All of this was happening while he was trying to build this new business. And then within a year as well, the Squire fell on the ice and damaged his knee quite badly. So things weren't going well. But fairly early on, A.D. Noe decided to not honor his promises in the contract that they had written together, and the result was that the Squire decided to file a lawsuit against A.D. Noe in the Hopkinsville courts. And I'll read you, actually, Edgar Cayce told somebody about this lawsuit a few years later, but he described it, I thought, pretty well. He said, Mr. Noe was to do certain things, I was to do certain things, and whatever profit was made out of it was to be divided equally. He said, in other words, he was to establish an office, and for the work to be conducted, and certain fees were to be charged for the work, and so on. He said, before I entered into the contract, I had several men who were supposed to be honorable, upright, good businessmen, attorneys, lawyers, doctors, to hear one of the readings and question it themselves and tell me whether I had a right to make such a contract or not. The contract was drawn. The judges of the court told me that it was all right, legal and everything. And he had some concerns about this because he knew that there were laws against practicing medicine without a license, but he got these legal opinions that told him it was appropriate. And then he says 6 or 8 months later, the circuit judge decided to make an offer to buy the contract out from Mr. Noe. The judge was named Judge Hanbury. He offered to buy the contract from Mr. Noe and pay him several $1,000s for the contract. And then when he decided to bring this lawsuit and with his father, the case wound up being tried in front of Judge Hanbury, the same judge who tried to buy out the contract. But then he said, even though he had given him a written opinion that the contract was legal and he had later offered to buy the contract, he ruled from the bench that the contract was illegal. He said because it was based on practicing medicine without a license, there was an illegal basis for the contract, and so he instructed the jury to dismiss the case. And you can see this is actually a picture of the courthouse where Edgar Cayce, where the trial happened, but this is actually a picture of the verdict from the jury. It says, we, the jury, find on the instructions from the court, find for the defendants, which was Mr. Noe. So that was the outcome of that, and it just didn't go well for Edgar Cayce. And after having seen the animosity coming his way from both the richest man in town and the judge in town, it was sort of the final straw for him, and he never came back to never lived in Hopkinsville again. This was when he relocated to Selma, Alabama. There was another lawsuit or lawsuits around Edgar Cayce, I think later, when because of Morton Blumenthal. You've probably heard his name as well, but he had first met Morton Blumenthal in 1925. He was a New York stockbroker, and he had showed tremendous enthusiasm and support for Edgar Cayce's work. He made major investments in it. He was had more readings than anyone else ever did from Edgar Cayce, more recorded readings. He funded Edgar Cayce's move to Virginia Beach, where they had been told was the best place for them to establish themselves. He funded the construction of the hospital. The building still stands today in Virginia Beach, and it admitted its first patient in 1929. But again, things didn't go well. It didn't take even though Morton was funding the activities, he also founded a university at the same time, and he wound up just finding that he had some disagreements about how the hospital was being run. Again, there was some mishaps, and the man that they had planned to run the hospital, Dr. Thomas House, became sick within a few months of the hospital opening and ultimately passed away. And they had some staffing issues because of that. But there was a change of priorities. Morton Blumenthal just found that he wasn't as interested in it as he had been, and some other issues came up between them. But then ultimately in 1931, he not only terminated the support for the hospital, but he also told the Cayces that even though he had told them that they could live in the house that he had bought for them, he decided to reclaim it from them. So they were not only without their planned business, but they were without the house that they had been living in for many years in Virginia Beach. And then there was litigation between the investors in the hospital. This Morton Blumenthal, and David Kahn was also one of the investors, but they had Morton disagreed with whether David Kahn had honored all of his commitments to provide funding for the hospital, and so he brought litigation with him, and that litigation lasted for over 7 years. And this was a very big part of Edgar Cayce's life all for that entire time, because David Kahn was still involved and still getting readings about what should I do about this litigation. It went on for it was a very stressful time for them. In addition, Edgar Cayce, right after the hospital closed, they were still trying to find ways to continue with their work of doing the readings, and they took a trip up to New York to be there for a week to give readings. And this was at the height of Morton Blumenthal's animosity toward them, and he had been told in one of his readings that he had had a past life as Achilles in the Trojan War. And I think this is an example of the wrath of Achilles coming out in his personality. But he set up this circumstance for Edgar, and not only Edgar, but Gertrude and Gladys as well, to be arrested in New York for telling fortunes. There were laws against telling fortunes in many states at the time. Actually, I have Jessica Newell, the Edgar Cayce archivist, to thank for sharing some information with me about the history of laws against telling fortunes. But it did have to some extent a sort of racist component to it, that it was a way of isolating and excluding people who were out of place culturally, people who were immigrants or gypsies or people of other colors who had been making living telling fortunes, or had that as a part of their lives. But Edgar Cayce fell victim to these laws as well. But he also was falling victim to this plan by Morton Blumenthal to humiliate them. Frankly, he paid for the female police officers to stay at the hotel where they were staying and giving readings, and to ask for a reading. They didn't have a space for a reading, but they kept pestering Gladys day after day and said, "Could you please put us in? We'll pay you 3 times the regular price for a reading." And finally, Gladys had a cancellation on the last day, and she said, "All right, I'll fit you in." And then that was when these 2 policewomen got a reading, and then right after the reading, arrested all 3 of them. And Morton Blumenthal had also arranged for the newspaper cameras to be there when they got arrested. So it was quite an embarrassing experience for them, and very troublesome. But fortunately, there were friends that posted bail. The trial happened in just 9 days later, and even though there was news coverage, this is an example of it from the New York Times, psychic lecturer and his wife arrested, and there was news coverage throughout the period from the arrest to the trial. But there was ultimately a successful outcome for the trial, and they went back to Virginia Beach. He had another arrest 4 years later in Detroit. He was accused of practicing medicine without a license after having given a reading for a man. And he ultimately, in this case, he decided not to go to trial because it would have involved them staying for quite a while, so as far away as Detroit. And he decided to plea bargain, but it also, even though all four of them had been arrested, Gertrude, Gladys, and this time Hugh Lynn was with them as well, it allowed the charges to be dropped against the others besides Edgar. So he just was on probation for a few months after the trial was over. Well, I think that you have a sense that there was a lot of conflict in Edgar Cayce's life, but I wanted to talk about the types of conflicts that we get involved in. There are really, I think it's when you think about the different kinds of conflicts you are involved in, there are sometimes when you're in charge, when you have more weight in the conflict than the other person. There are times when you are in conflicts with someone who's more or less in an equal situation to you. And there are times when you are engaged with someone that's more powerful than you. I think that when I think about conflicts where you have more feeling of being in charge of the outcome, you have either some physical advantage, you have some financial advantage, you might have a political or legal advantage, you might be the person that has authority in the situation, you might be have an organizational advantage if you're the parent, if you're the boss, the teacher, loan officer, government official, if you're the landowner and someone encroaching on your land, or if you're the investor or someone who has other financial advantages, someone like Morton Blumenthal that has the financial advantages. There's times when they're mostly conflicts between equals. There are times when it's between two spouses, or between two coworkers, between siblings or neighbors or classmates or business partners. So there's different times when conflicts fall into this category. And there's times when you have a disadvantage, when you have some physical weakness, when you're being bullied, when you have some financial disadvantage, when you have a political or legal disadvantage. Or if you're the worker and you're having a conflict with your boss, if you're the student and you're having a conflict with your teacher, if you're having a conflict with your parent, or if you're having conflict with, it's a result of systemic discrimination, or some other kind of government oppression. If these are some of the conflicts that we find ourselves in from time to time, where we are at a distinct structural disadvantage. So it's interesting, valuable to think about where your conflict falls in these varieties of conflict. I think it's helpful to talk about some of the myths and truths about conflict. Over the years, I think that I've seen in my work as a lawyer and in my involvement with spiritual groups and nonprofit groups, I think that there's a lot of different I guess I would call them misconceptions about what conflict is and the role that it plays in our lives in general. I think that there are times when people don't understand or try to distance themselves from conflict as well, and try to think that it's doesn't play the role that it should play in their lives. And this first one I call the kumbaya myth, that it's just there's sometimes where people just say, I'm on my spiritual path, and there is no that means that there is no conflict. I don't see conflict. I don't hear conflict. I don't speak conflict. I have wished conflict away out of my life, and or I just deny that conflict exists because I'm on my spiritual path, and I'm not deviating from it to think about conflict. And I think there's also what I call the white flag myth. I think that sometimes I've seen people sort of think that being enlightened or being on a spiritual path means sort of staying on their mountaintop. They're aware that there is conflict, but they just want to sort of stay above it or stay above the fray. I remember someone in my study group years ago, he was joking, but he just said, when I meditate, I'm up in my cabin in the woods, all is right with the world. And then I come back into the city and there's these people here. And so, he understood that he needed to, needed to think about how he can integrate his spiritual life in with interacting with other people, but sometimes people just choose to avoid it. And then there's people who there's this other sort of myth I think I've seen from time to time about conflict, where people just say, well, I don't really need to engage in conflict because the outcome is predetermined. And so I will just sit back and watch, and I'll just be a spectator here because I know it'll all work out great. So I'll just sit back and watch. And I think that that's, I think of another person in my study group, Larry, who, things would come up about conflict or conversations about politics or something. His expression was, well, we're just ants on a log floating down the river. And his attitude was just sort of like, there's nothing for me to do. There's nothing for me to do because it's all predestined. And I think there's other ways to think about conflict and what our role is in it as well. There's the sort of the karma myth I think of, that where people sort of think, well, if there's conflict in your life, it's because of something you've done. It's your fault. It's at some energetic level in what you're been sending out into the world, or it's at some, if you're suffering from conflict or hardship, it's because of something in your karma from a past life, and the blame should be aimed at you. And that's you are in fact the source of your own conflict. And then there's some people who take the opposite view, what I call the villain myth. Conflict is always the other person's fault. I'm never wrong, but if only that other person would change, things would be totally fine. So I think it's helpful to just sort of think about and put those concepts out into the conversation, to think about, well, where do you fall in your thinking about how conflict plays a role in your life? And I think that, where I see the truth is, and maybe it's because I certainly work as a lawyer where conflict is a part of my life on a day-to-day basis, but I really think that it's an inevitable part of being in life on Earth, that conflict's going to show up in our lives. It certainly showed up in Edgar Cayce's life, but I think everyone has an example, as I saw from the circumstances in the chat, that there are people who, conflicts are part of being human. And I think what we'll see is that as we talk a little further, is that spiritually enlightened people do engage with conflict as part of their spiritual journey. And I just put this quote here because it's, it summarizes what I think of as well. I think that, standing away from conflict just means that there's an opportunity for bad people to have freer reign. Bad men need do nothing more than that good men should look on and do nothing. So I don't think that being on a spiritual path means that we stand back from conflict, because we need to be a part of making the world, making there be less bad in the world, frankly. I think that we need to be aware that not always is the outcome predestined. And I think that this is just one example from the reading, but it says the outcome of a conflict depends, to be sure, upon the activities of the individual. So, I think that there's many other examples in the readings as well that we'll touch on, that where Edgar Cayce, the reading was encouraging the people seeking advice to double their efforts to make a difference in the outcome. And I think that, sometimes people think conflict is the result of their own activities. Sometimes people think it's only the fault of the other person. But I think that, each conflict is different. And I think we really need to be discerning about whether the conflict is an opportunity for positive change and it's for spiritual growth for us or for others, or maybe sometimes there are cases where both people are going to be having a learning experience out of that conflict, but it's not always the same from conflict to conflict. But we're going to talk about how we can create a toolbox for conflict resolution, and we'll talk about practical tips for these elements of conflict resolution. We'll talk about how to deal with the emotions that come up with conflict resolution, and talk about some spiritual perspectives about it as well. The first concept that I really wanted to touch on is this concept of the drama triangle. I think that when you think about conflict, if you think about, just imagining your circumstance in a conflict at work, or in a conflict in your family, I think that it's very easy, or in a conflict at school, or I think it's very easy for us to put ourselves in this drama triangle. And I think if you think of any movie you've seen, for the favorite movie or the last movie you've seen, whatever it is, you can probably name who the victim was in the story and who the villain was in the story and who the hero was. And sometimes the victim and the hero are the same person, but you can, these are very evident roles that we tend to put ourselves into when we're thinking about conflict. But I think that when we look at trying to solve conflict, when we get stuck in this drama triangle, it can cause problems for actually reaching a resolution of the conflict. And I draw on some advice from this wonderful man, Gary Harper, who's both a lawyer and a mediator, who's written a lot about conflict resolution. But he makes the point, he says, you know, when you're trying to fit yourself into this drama triangle, we tend to always put ourselves in the role of the victim rather than in the role of the villain. But as he says, in conflict, each person feels hit first. So, you know, when you're thinking about what the person that you've labeled as the villain is thinking, they see themselves often as the victim too. So it's just helpful to realize that that's the perspective that another person may have in the conflict. And then, you know, if we're going to put ourselves on that drama triangle, we might put ourselves in the role of the hero. But, you know, the comment he made was one person's justice is another person's revenge. So, you know, if you ask two people who have just finished a fight what happened, both of them are going to say, well, the other guy started it. And so, you know, both of those two people think of the other person as the person who is the bad person and they think of themselves as the person who's seeking justice. So there can be two sides to that drama, to where the roles are placed in that drama triangle. So he said, you know, this Gary Harper suggests, as he says here, we need to find a way, if possible, for us to stand up for ourselves in a way that doesn't knock the other person down. And one of the ways to do that is to start to focus on the problem, what's in the center of the triangle, rather than on labels on the people. And it may be as simple as just saying, you know, if it's something at home, if it's, you know, the other person always leaves their towel on the bathroom floor, you know, rather than saying you're a slob, labeling them as the villain, say that we have a problem, the towels are on the floor. Name the problem rather than labeling the person. Focus on the purpose. What are you trying to reach for as a solution? How do you find a solution that's consistent with your ideal, rather than focusing on putting someone on this drama triangle? And I think that this is a sample from the reading, but it just says, best the conditions be considered from other standpoints rather than bringing hurt. So I just think that, you know, the readings are really encouraging us to start thinking about how, rather than labeling the other people, but think about, well, what does it look like from their standpoint? How can we both look at something together, looking at the problem rather than looking at why the other person is necessarily wrong and I'm right. So one of the ways that we can do that is to start looking at the needs and interests that are in the center of the triangle. What's the motive of the other person? What's my motive? And see if we can work toward finding common needs and interests. And and here's, you know, some that I think are really universal, that we can start to identify as things that most people will agree with and find a need for. We sometimes are seeking independence, whether it's a kid saying, I need more independence from a parent. Sometimes we need a feeling of belonging. If the conflict is because I'm feeling excluded from the in crowd at work. Sometimes people feel that they need a sense of recognition, that they, you know, they want their achievements to be recognized more at work than the boss is giving them credit for. And so a lot of times the common need and interest between the two people in a conflict is needing a feeling of safety. So these are some of the things that we can start to reframe what our focus is in a conflict. And I think that, you know, when we start to focus on common needs and interests, it helps us to start thinking about how we can apply the golden rule. As you would that men should do to you, do ye even so unto them. This is not merely a trite saying, it is a living truth. So if we can if we can start to reframe the conflict into something that that can reach toward a situation where both sides are looking together toward a solution. This is this graphic actually I found, it's a stencil for a playground, which I actually thought was really useful, but it's just sort of a good starting place for finding solutions to, rather than just keeping the playground fight going on. It gives a little list of suggestions to kids about some options that they can do. They can talk it out, they can tell them to stop. There's some options that we can do, that kids can start with. But I think that in the world of law, where I spend my days, there are very formal structures about the process for conflict resolution. But I think that, even the concepts are the same, whether conflict resolution is at a very formal level or at a very informal level, whether it's just two people talking about, how are we going to solve the conflict about who's going to use the car tonight or whatever it is. We need to think about the steps of resolving the conflict. And the first step is to just set the stage for how to resolve the conflict. What's our purpose? What are the place, time, and tone that we're going to use? What are the rules that we're going to use to define how we engage about this? And sometimes you'll see, depending on where you are in the power structure within the conflict with the other person, is it going to be your rules that define how the conflict is resolved? If you're the person in power, is it going to be agreed rules, and is it going to be their rules? And sometimes it's simply a matter of saying, if you're in the middle of an argument with a loved one in your family, and you just say, I noticed that we're both talking about this. We're both tired right now. Could we set another time to talk about it? Just to think about what will help set the stage for a successful conflict resolution. In my legal world, there's court rules, there's courthouses and so forth, but it doesn't have to be that formal. It can simply be thinking about what are the rules that we're going to use to engage, and can we at least talk about what the topics are that we want to talk about? Can we at least define it? Because sometimes you can see in family arguments, particularly, you can be talking about who's going to use the car, but all of a sudden it turns into other things jump onto the agenda. And it's worth thinking about whether we can create an agreed list of what it is that we're talking about. In a legal brief, we start out the brief with issues presented, and sometimes it's not the same issues in one side's brief and the other side's brief, but it's just at least we've had to state what it is that we want to talk about. And then after that, there needs to be a time for both parties in the conflict to share their story. And again, this is sort of, drawing on legal concepts to talk about things that can be thought of in a more informal way. But, in defining what is a fair process in the legal system, there are two core concepts. And one is notice, and that's sort of, helping people understand what's the stage setting for this and what's the agenda. And the other is the opportunity to be heard. And if those two elements are there, notice and opportunity to be heard, then it's considered a fair process. But the opportunity to be heard, to be listened to, is a really key part of conflict resolution. So each person has to share their story. And when you're sharing your story, these are the things that lawyers keep in mind, but I think it's also valuable for when people are in a more informal settings. Stay grounded in the facts. We start a brief with the facts section. And I think, these fact questions, what can we focus on? What, why, when, how, where, and who? There's an old Rudyard Kipling poem that's like, I had 6 loyal serving men. They taught me all I knew, and their names were what and why and when and how and where and who. But it's just, think about those things. If you can stay grounded in the facts, because one of the things that staying grounded in the facts helps you do is to stay away from labeling people and stay away from contempt for the other person. So you're just staying focused on what the facts are that you want to talk about. And then think about inventorying your strengths and your persuasive points. And I just put these points here as this is sort of, your mini law school part of this. But this is the 3 points I use from Aristotle from time to time: logos, ethos, and pathos. those. But I've shared this. Actually, I used to teach legal writing for a few years, and this is something I picked up at that time. But define your arguments in 3 possible ways. And one is logos, which is just the logic. What are the laws? What is the logic that goes behind your argument? What is the ethos that goes behind your argument? What are the ethical values? What are the sort of basic principles that you might be able to find to that you could agree on, basic principles like kindness or fairness or things that, common values that you have, moral values that can help you understand something that perhaps it's simply kindness. And you need to think about how you can frame your arguments around those, whether you can find common ground around an ethical value that you both agree with. And then pathos is, what arguments do you have that can evoke sympathy from the other side? And if you're trying to understand what pathos is, you only have to think about how kids ask for things from their parents, because they are very effective at thinking of ways to evoke sympathy, whether it's pleading, whether it's persistence, whether it's about pity, whatever it is, but who can resist a child that's pulling on their heartstrings? So pathos is the sympathy part of your argument. So think about the ways that you can express your points in these 3 ways. This is the 3 principles of how to kind of create your checklist of what are effective arguments. When you're after you've told your story, sometimes you do it before and sometimes you do it after the other person. But when you're a listener, that's a super important part of the conflict resolution process. Even if it's really hard, even if in that moment there's so much anger in the circumstance, there's so much drama and emotion in the conflict, think about, even if you don't want to give that person any time, you don't think they have anything of value to say, think about, it's just temporary for you to listen to that story, but maybe you can give them the benefit of that temporary amount of listening. And sometimes there's a lot of listening to be done. My husband said he had a mentor once that told him, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So, sometimes there's a lot of listening that can be helpful. Sometimes we should be listening twice as much as we speak. But you need to think about whether listening is something that you feel safe in. Someone's really on the pale and using name calling or shame or humiliation in their language, you need to be able to create some boundaries around it. But listening can be a really important part of this conflict resolution process. Sometimes this is I think a helpful point is to create some conversational speed bumps from time to time, just to say, to repeat John, it's really helpful to be able, it's really helpful for me to be hearing this from you. Something like that, just to give some feedback on the what you're hearing. Show some empathy if you can. It doesn't mean agreeing, but it just means I understand that these are your feelings. And in some way validate that that is their experience. Even though you may not agree with it, you may not think they're telling the story completely or accurately. They're telling what is their experience. See if you can paraphrase key concerns and say, what I hear you saying is this, these are the things that are important to you. If you can, ask open-ended questions, stay curious and ask some more. In the legal world, we ask tough questions sometimes too of our opposing side. We cross-examine people, and if there's an opportunity to do that, that sometimes can be helpful. But sometimes in a more informal setting, you need to think about how you can ask questions that keeps the conversation going toward a solution. Reframe if you can, to focus on how the unmet needs of both parties can be met, and then if you can, summarize the big picture and see what it is that you've heard from both sides and how you can start moving toward solutions. And this is again a quote from the readings: listen oft to others and condemn none. See if after you've both had a chance to share your story, see if you can find a way to explore interests and needs, and see what you can do to seek common ground. If there's compromises, sometimes that's a part of it. If there's concessions, if there's incremental options, if there's perhaps a truce, you say, well, we're just going a break from this for a while. We'll come back to this, but in the meantime, we'll just have this truce about this subject. There may be more than one answer to finding a solution, but the ultimate goal is to work toward a solution that has accountability about who will do what and when should be a part of it as well. In the legal world, we get things signed off with formal orders from the third party decision maker, the judge of the jury. And then, another part of, in addition to the process for conflict resolution, I think it's really important to think about the emotions that are associated with the conflict being in our lives, and to stay mindful about those. And I think that there's really two big emotions that come up around conflict. And the first one of those is anger, because there's so often anger that's a part of the conflict process. But I just, we need to be aware of the anger, first of all, and realize that as we move toward a solution of the conflict, that we're going to have to move at some point, move past at some level, move past anger, or incorporate it in, be bigger than the anger part of the conflict. You can't shake hands with a clenched fist. And I think that if you can become mindful of your anger, you can consider, I know that sometimes anger is a very legitimate emotion in the context of conflict, but if you can think about shifting from judgment of the other person to observing yourself and observing the other person rather than focusing on the judgment. About moving from defensiveness to curiosity in the context of the conflict. If you can, stay focused on whether your listening skills can add strength here. Edgar Cayce didn't say never be angry. He said be angry, but sin not. And he said, for he that is never angry is worth little, because there's a lot to be angry about, as we all know, in the modern world. But he that is angry and controlleth it not is worthless. And I think that one thing that's important to do also is to distinguish our feelings of anger from hate. And because hate is a destructive emotion, anger is a response to what's happened, but hate is when anger turns toward a specific person and it becomes destructive. And contempt is where we are labeling that person with disgust, and humiliation is where we're trying to impose shame on that other person in a way that isn't constructive. I think that this graphic, I have Brene Brown to thank for this graphic, but this is, I think, a very helpful tool to be aware of as we think about anger, that behind the anger, it may be a lot of other emotions, because there's so many emotions that might be connected to where this conflict is coming from. But think about if you're receiving anger from the other person, what might be behind that anger? And if you're the one who's feeling the anger in the conflict, what might be behind your anger? If you can label it, sometimes it helps you to start to process it and be able to move forward from it. The other big emotion that comes along with conflict is fear. One of the ways, I think fear comes a lot from uncertainty, and that's very natural. It's a very natural response to that uncertainty that comes with conflict. But I think one way that we can start to feel a little bit of ownership is to just think about, is there a way that you can lean out from the conflict, take a break, manage the emotions, set a time for the conflict? Or are there ways that you could help manage your fear by leaning in more into the conflict? I use the expression, know when to hold them and know when to fold them, from poker, but it's just like sometimes thinking about how you can use leaning out or leaning in as a way to help you manage your fear can be really helpful. Can you take a break? Can you opt out? Can you opt out? Or can you help redefine the battle in some way? But maybe your fear would be managed by leaning in more into the conflict. If you're afraid of what your boss is going to say to you at a meeting next week, is there a way that you can start leaning in and saying, well, this is how I want to make my case. I'm going to be prepared for that conversation. So I'm going to think about how I can use my voice, how I can make my case in that conflict. Name what you fear. See if you can just write it down even, and see if that just writing it down, being aware of what it is that you fear, can help manage it. And I think that this concept, really helps to manage our fear too, because if we're afraid of losing the conflict, think about, I love this expression from Nelson Mandela: I never lose, I either win or I learn. And you know, he's someone who knows a lot about both of those. So I just think that it's helpful to have that perspective about it. And here's a couple of readings from about that can help give us perspective on the fear that comes along with conflict. This is advice Edgar gave to Hugh Lin, but he said, think about problems not being problems, but rather opportunities. And keep perspective. It says, do not see the dark side too oft, turn it over. Know that there's another side to every question. Know that the Lord thy God laughed even at the cross. So sometimes it can just help to get some perspective around the fear and be conscious of it. I think it's really important to think about what our spiritual toolbox is for conflict resolution as well. I think that being ready for conflict, knowing that it's going to be a part of our life, and building in our spiritual strengths all through our lives so that when conflicts do come, which they will, that we'll feel ready. Each of us meets his own problems in accordance to the development of that individual. So conflicts hit us at wherever we are in our life at that point. But if you can feel ready for and spiritually strong, then I think you'll feel stronger when those conflicts do come your way. I think that it's important to stay grounded in our fundamental principles. And I think one of the best places to look is just the listing of principles. I mean, all the content of the Search for God books is great, but sometimes just keeping some of those basic words and principles from the different chapters in the Search for God can be really helpful. Remembering the golden rule. If you are finding yourself engaged, inflamed about a conflict, remember to think, how does it feel from the other person's perspective? Because that is recommended so many times in the reading, to just at least stop at some point and think, how does this other person feel about it? I think that this concept is really important one in the context of conflict resolution, which is there's a great group called the Arbinger Institute that is focused on global peace work. And they really touch on this idea that every conflict comes from thinking of the other person as an object rather than thinking of the other person as a person. And this concept, either I engage with others in the concept in the realm of an I and an it, an object, or I engage with the other person knowing that that other person is as valuable as I am. I, thou concept. So I think that just keeping that in mind is like, how am I thinking about this conflict? You know, am I thinking myself more important than the other person? Am I thinking of the other person as an object standing in my way, or am I thinking about that person as a person? And I think that another really valuable spiritual tool if we find ourselves especially getting unbalanced in the emotions of a conflict, is to remember that if you can find an advisor or a group, whether it's a study group you're a part of, or somebody that you can have as a sounding board to serve as the reality tester for when you make choices, and somebody who can ask you those questions that draw out your own wisdom. I think, mentioned the Search for God materials, and I just wanted to touch on a few of these. This is my Search for God text, but just keeping some of these concepts in your mind as you're going through the difficult times can be really helpful. Meditation, of course, is a key tool. Be joyous in your problems. Know that he walks and talks with you when you open your heart and mind to his presence. You can get guidance, and you can build that into how you move forward with the conflict. Cooperation with the divine forces. Focus on your ideal, bring it into the conflict and say, how can I bring whatever it is that I've chosen as my ideal, my purpose, my sense of meaning in life, how can I bring that into this conflict circumstance? As you face the light of truth, the shadows will fall farther behind. Faith is so important in conflict. And I think that one of the things that I keep coming back to, this is my favorite chapter actually in the Search for God materials, is patience. But I just really feel like patience is where we find in the Cayce work the idea that we can know that God's kingdom is here now, and we can also know that it's not here yet. We can hold both of those concepts in our minds, the already and the not yet, in our minds together when we wrap our minds around the concept of patience. That is where we can not get stuck in, oh, everything's Shangri-La right now. And we also don't get stuck in it's, a world of sorrows right now, but we can hold both of those concepts in our mind, that God's presence is here in our lives right now, and the best is yet to come as well at the same time. The cross and the crown, I think, is just a valuable tool as well, to just remember that in times of trouble, in times of conflict, in times of suffering and stress, there's a crown that's connected with it. Those two concepts go hand in hand. And I think that we need to it helps to just keep that in mind as well. And just remembering the oneness that we are a part of always. And I think also the chapter on day and night is just a really great comfort for me as well, just to remember that life does have cycles, and that when we feel stuck in a problem, there will be a time when they will come, and the night comes, but day comes as well. I think just, this is just a great quote to remember from a spiritual angle. In thy daily dealings with others, forget not to interpret the problem of the day from a spiritual angle. So looking at how we apply our toolbox in different contexts of conflict, I think that, there are times when you are the boss and you're dealing with workers. There's times when you're the teacher or the parent and you're dealing with a student or a child. And I think you have the structural advantage in that circumstance. Then you're going to be dealing with a conflict, but you have more power in that relationship to dictate what the outcome is. And I think that that's a place where we need to remember to use our power wisely. So I think that what the readings teach us is to keep that I-thou relationship even in that context. And I think about this story too. This is sort of a cautionary tale that Edgar Cayce told in his recounting of his own life. That I told you the story about his lawsuit that he was in Hopkinsville. Well, the judge ruled against him, as you know, but Edgar Cayce, so much bad had happened to him in that year or so before the judge made that ruling, that he was at the edge of what he could take, and he lost his temper. And he said, I'll read you what he said. Actually, he just said, he misused his power from his perspective. And I'll just read you. He said, I don't think that my power is anything to be toyed with. He said, he was telling this to someone many years later about this lawsuit. He said, I don't know whether I ever told you this circumstance or not. I hate to even think of it sometimes. And perhaps it was only a coincidence. But then he tells the story about what the judge did to rule against him. And he says, something within me at the time after that verdict made me rise and ask the judge if I might speak without being ruled as contempt of court. He said, I might speak. That same something said, for the lie, this is him talking to the judge. He said, for the lie you have this day enacted, the worms of your body will eat you while you are still yet alive. In less than 2 years, this was true, and the judge lived 2 years in this agony. Perhaps it was only a coincidence. Possibly it was playing with fire. That was his description of it. But he had this power. He knew he had this power, and he lost his temper, and he felt like he caused the judge to have some suffering after this lawsuit. The judge did die a little more than 2 years later. I actually wound up finding his death certificate thanks to ancestry.com, and he died of not worms but of sarcoma after 2 years of suffering. He was only 48 years old when he died. And I think, I have a little bit of skepticism about whether Edgar Cayce was the cause of his death, but Edgar Cayce himself saw it as a cautionary tale that he carried along with him about misusing, in this case, his psychic power, not structural power, but psychic power against someone because of his uncontrolled emotions. And he realized that he needed to remember to use his power wisely. So I think it's just a very valuable tale that he took in from his own life about when we have power and we misuse it in a conflict, it will come back to it'll be something that we'll need to address later on. I thought I'd just share with you this mindfulness exercise that my sister mentioned to me, but she had taken class on mindfulness one time, and she said they did this exercise in the class, and you can just imagine yourself, but they had everyone in the class just walk around the room, and they said, imagine as you're walking around the room that you're the most important person in this room. So just carry yourself in your body. You can sit down, move, walk around, stand up, but carry yourself with the feeling that you're the most important person in the room. And then they did the same exercise. They said, now imagine you're walking around the room as the least important person in this room. And how does that feel in your body when you walk around, when you interact with other people? How does that feel? And then now go around the room and imagine that everyone in the room is equal. And how does that make you feel in your body and how you move around the room? But I just think that as we're the person who's in charge, just keep in mind to yourself, with how does it feel to be in this room with me, or in this conflict with me, based on whether I'm feeling that I'm the most important person in the room or not. And I just, this is also, when we're in charge, how we treat others, even when we're in charge, reflects who you really are. I take a walk in the neighborhood here, and this church has a reader board, and they just put in a reader board that flashes different colors. And I just thought, this is so interesting. How you treat others reflects who you really are. So remember your values. When you have the chance to be in charge of a conflict, even in that context, it's not an occasion to misuse your power, because how you treat others, even in that context, reflects who you really are. Well, what about those situations where it's a conflict between equals, between spouses, between neighbors, between siblings? I think that it's very easy to assume that we aren't dealing with an equal when we're in a conflict. We always feel like we're the victim, and the other person is the villain. So it just, it's helpful to sort of frame your understanding of the conflict. Is it really a conflict where I'm the victim, or do we really in most ways have equal power, but in the structure that we're dealing with? But in this context, when we're dealing with equals, this is occasion to use all of the tools in our toolbox that we've talked about, the practical tools, setting the agenda, listening to each other's stories, and moving toward common needs and interests, thinking about our emotions in the context, and thinking about our spiritual tools in our toolbox as well. But also, one thing we just haven't talked about is there an opportunity for you to think about whether there should be a third person to be a decider or mediator in the context? I know in our legal system we always have a third party decider, but or a mediator, but sometimes that can be helpful in the informal context as well. So what about a third context for conflict where we are the one that's at the disadvantage? And I think that, where we are in conflict with powers that are above us, whether it's financial, whether it's structural, whether it's, organizational. So we need to think about how we deal with conflict in that context. And the person that I think is the most valuable to listen to in this context is someone who actually was another Edgar Cayce fan, but his name was Howard Thurman. And he was also a tremendous theologian and mystic. He lived in the 20th century, died in 1980, but he was also a mentor to Martin Luther King, friends with Martin Luther King's parents. He and his wife were friends with his parents, and he wrote many, many books, but he was a wonderful interfaith theologian and mystic who wrote an entire book, Jesus and the Disinherited. I have a picture of it here, that was about how to deal with life when you are at a structural disadvantage. He talked about how Jesus in his life actually was at a structural disadvantage because he was part of the Jewish community that had no legal rights in the Roman system. And he talked about the comparisons between that and Black Americans in the world in which he lived, and gave some really great ideas, I think, about how you deal with life and moving forward with your life when you're in, as he called it, a fixed and unremitting status of inferiority. I put another picture here on this slide just to remember to mention that there's a new biography of Howard Thurman that just came out this week that's called What Makes You Come Alive, because he's famous for the phrase, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is people who have come alive. So he taught in this Jesus and the Disinherited. People say that Martin Luther King carried a copy of this book in his briefcase with him wherever he went, because it was just so invaluable to think about how you deal with where you are in at a disadvantage. But first of all, it's important to understand that not all hardship is karmic, that you don't necessarily need to feel that you're complicit in your own oppression and your own situation of being at a disadvantage. And there are solutions that might be out of your control, but keep in mind what you can control. And Howard Thurman focused on 3 really important aspects of what you can do when you're at the disadvantage. And he called them staying away from the 3 hounds of hell, is the phrase that he used. But the three things that he really wanted to focus on is, even in that situation where you're at a disadvantage, don't have fear, don't cave into hate, and don't cave into hypocrisy. And I think that it's really valuable to just take a look at what he said about these 3 very important factors, about fear, hate, and hypocrisy, and how his words really paralleled with what Edgar Cayce said on these very same subjects. I put these 2 pictures here because this is a wonderful painting of Howard Thurman that was painted by Peggy Strong, who was a Edgar Cayce reading recipient by coincidence. And this is another picture of Edgar Cayce that was also painted by Edgar Cayce reading recipient Anne Neumann. And I just think that the parallels between them are so strong. But he said, when we know in our heart that we're a child of God, it gives us a new courage that is unconquerable within and without. He said, to fear a man is a basic denial of the integrity of his life. And the great affirmation of Jesus, he said, is that man is a child of God. And knowing that place that we hold in the grand scheme of things is a way to move out of our fear. And Edgar Cayce said the same thing. He said, doth not the Father care for everyone? So why be afraid? If we're on the Lord's side, who may be against us? Perfect love casts out fear. You can choose to be afraid, or you can choose to give your heart and soul to life everlasting. What about deception? This sometimes is one of the more complex concepts that Howard Thurman was working with, but he just said, he really made the point that if someone is oppressing us or putting us at a disadvantage, and it causes us to start to lie in that circumstance, or to engage in hypocrisy or deception, he said, we become a deception. And he said, Jesus really asked us to be genuine in our lives, and that's one of the most important fundamental concepts we can hold on to, is that hypocrisy is a tribute yielded by those who are weak, that it causes us to become full of sound and fury, and our words signify nothing if we cave into deception and hypocrisy. He said sincerity in our relationships with humans is the same as our sincerity to God. And Edgar Cayce also focused on the value of being honest, because it keeps us in balance and it makes our experiences more harmonious. So I really think that that's a valuable concept to keep in our minds, that if we find ourselves being put down or made less than, we can still hold on to some of our key core values. And one of those is to be genuine with our lives. And then the final thing that he said is to not give in to hate, even though the circumstances may be terrible. But he said, hatred bears deadly and bitter fruit. It cannot be controlled once it is set in motion, and it is destructive. It is death to the spirit. It is disintegration of our values. And Edgar Cayce said the same thing. Hate is destructive. And we really need to stay away from even though we may feel anger, and that's okay. We don't want to turn that anger into something that's destructive by allowing it to feed into hate. I wanted to just point out here a few things from Jesus and some of the other wisdom teachings about how we can engage in nonviolent conflict, and it can be a really valuable part of our spiritual life, rather than something that we see as separate from or taking away from our spiritual life. And there's some examples here of conflict in Jesus's life. He didn't walk away from conflict. He leaned in. He was someone who leaned in. And you think about how he leaned into conflict about money. He was the one who turned the tables. Every one of the Gospels talks about this table turning episode where he went into the temple and said, this is a place where we need to be focused on other things besides exchanging money for animals for the sacrifice. And so he leaned in. He didn't just let things be the way they were. He resisted the temptations, the story of him being in the wilderness and resisting the temptations for earthly power. He pushed back. He didn't say, this is, I'll go along with what other people are suggesting, whether the evil powers were suggesting to him. He confronted rigid doctrines in the scribes and the Pharisees. He said, let's think about things differently. He didn't shy away from those conversations, and he didn't shy away from military might. He stood his ground and said what he felt needed to be said in the circumstances. He thought things through, and he wanted to have a deeper consideration of everything that came his way. And I think, here's some other concepts from the Bible, but just, think about wrestling against the world's rulers. Think about Jacob wrestling with his angel. Think about how we can rise up and stand firm. There's something about leaning into life, leaning into what matters to us, to find the answers, to find the resolutions. That's can be a part of our spiritual life. And I have Wynne Radford in Hopkinsville to thank for connecting me with the work of Paul F. Knitter. He is a wonderful man who's written about the connections between Buddhism and Christianity, but he has great ideas about how the strength of Buddhism is on the inner life, but there's so many examples of Christianity, whether it's Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King or other people who have really reached out to engage with life and try to make a difference in the world. But he's trying to say that, as he says here, effective activism requires a solid mysticism. And if we can think about both of those components being a part of our spiritual path, it can really help integrate all of our life together into one consistent whole. He talked about how, Jesus opposed things, but he didn't give in to hate. And he talks about how we can use our personal spiritual transformation to then actively and consciously engage in the reform of the world and politics and economics, but we can use our spiritual strengths to not pull us away from the world, but to pull us into the world. So think about some of the conflict resolution stories for Edgar Cayce. I mentioned quite a few of the conflicts that he was dealing with, including his hospital and his father, his conflicts with the arrests, and share some stories about how some of these resolved for him. But even though his father was quite a character and a source of conflict in his life for all these years, he still had opportunities to make a difference in the life of his father. And I put this picture here of his father. This is a picture of all the study group members of the original study group and some other people at the Congress. But this is the squire in the midst of them. And, even though he was the person who a lot of us would have distanced ourselves from, Edgar Cayce built on the things that they had in common. The work, his father, for all of his faults, he was proud of his son's work, and Edgar Cayce built on that to pull him into ideas and things that would make a difference for him. He attended hundreds of readings. He was the conductor for readings, and he learned some things as he was there. He couldn't have not learned things. He participated. He didn't just attend the readings. He participated in the Search for God group, and he attended many of the Search for God sessions that were recorded. And because of his life with Edgar Cayce, he had occasion to be stretched out of his white supremacist views. In his world, everybody who wasn't the Anglo-Saxon Protestant was someone that he considered an outsider. But in Edgar Cayce's world, he was friends with the Blumenthals, a Jewish family. He was friends with David Kahn, another Jewish family. Tom Shagru, a Catholic, lived in their home with them as a member of their family. And these were all people that, the squire had to reconcile himself to being around. There were Zoroastrians and Hindus and Sikhs that came to visit and participate in activities related to the work and get readings and give speeches. And, he had to reconcile himself to this work being something that included more people than he had grown up with, and he had to see that the world was bigger than he might have framed it. So the dial moved at some level in his life because of Edgar Cayce's not giving up on him. I think that the story of the Blumenthals, this is a situation where Edgar Cayce was at a distinct economic disadvantage. The Blumenthals held the purse strings, and he didn't have a choice when they decided to pull out their support from the hospital and pull out from the giving them a home. He didn't have a choice about it, but he did have a choice about what his attitude was in response to it. And he just said, when it really came down to it, there was an opportunity for him to be hateful or angry or feel revengeful. And I think some people were encouraging him to act that way, but he took the other road and he just said, I have every confidence in Mr. Blumenthal, just saying, this is his choice. I'm going to have to live with it. But he didn't give in to hate. He didn't give in to fear in that moment. And as Hugh Lynn said here, he wrote to the Blumenthals after Edgar Cayce passed, and he said he had only love and compassion in his heart for you both at the end of his life. So I think that he saw that there were lessons to be learned on both sides, but he, even though it would cause tremendous hardship for him and it took away his dream, he didn't give in to hate in that moment. The stories about his arrests, think about what happened there. Again, these were not great circumstances in his life. It was a source of shame for him, but look at the things that happened because of these arrests. There were some lessons to be learned, and there were some opportunities to be had because of this. He saw what his friends could do in his time of need. Tom Shagru was there in New York working for another newspaper, and even though Morton Blumenthal had arranged for bad publicity about Edgar Cayce, Tom Shagru was working for the New York Herald Tribune and put in good articles about Edgar Cayce in the time of this arrest and trial. And then David Kahn came to his aid in a big way and helped arrange for friends to post bail for him and testified at the trial that wound up having a very successful outcome. They had a friendly judge that, instead of saying that they were telling fortunes, that decided that they were a duly incorporated ecclesiastical body and found for Edgar Cayce, and there was no guilty verdict. So I think that was a sign of good news. I think that he had support where he didn't expect it in a time of hardship for him. And then when he was arrested 4 years later in Detroit, there were more friends in need, people who posted his bail. He went into the jail, and Hugh Lynn told a wonderful story about the time when he was in jail. Hugh Lynn and Edgar Cayce were sent to the men's part of the jail, and Gertrude and Gladys were sent to the women's part, and the other people in the jail started gathering around Edgar and Hugh Lynn, and it seemed to be a little scary for them at first, and they were like, well, what are you in here for? And they felt a little threatened, and Edgar Cayce looked around the room and he started telling each one of the people why they were there. And he said, you think you're here because you were in a car accident, but the real reason is that you were angry about your child being sick, and so forth. He went around to every person. He gave a description of why they were there and what led up to the circumstances of their being there. It was a eye-opening experience for everyone else in the jail room with them, but he was able to show his powers to people who wouldn't have seen them otherwise. He had a successful outcome from it. He had to plea bargain, but it was something that he could very much live with. And it turned out that the probation officer that was assigned to him enjoyed the opportunity to come from Detroit down to Virginia Beach to see him, because he was a reading recipient himself, and he was a brother-in-law of someone that was a Search for God study group member. This is all a coincidence, but it just worked out great for him. And then Edgar Cayce had to go up at the end of the period of the months of probation to Detroit to finalize things. And when he was coming back on the train, you may have heard this story about this dream that Edgar Cayce had, but he had it on the train coming back from Detroit after this whole arrest experience was winding down. About he had a dream about coming back to live another lifetime in America in the year 2158. And he had a sense from that his work would last until then, that there was some lasting value of his work that would continue. And it all came out of this time of darkness, but he had a sense of hope that came out of it, that so there was a future for him, and a future and a meaning to the work that he was doing. A couple of conflict resolution stories had to do with his sons as well. And I think that this is valuable perspective that we can have in a spiritual way about conflict resolution as well, which is sometimes it can take lifetimes to resolve conflict. And the story that he had with Hughlin is a good example of that. But the story from the life readings was that they had a life together. Edgar and his son Hughlin had a life together where they were in conflict in 10,000 BC, where Hughlin was the king of Egypt, and Edgar Cayce was the high priest Ratad that wound up being exiled by the king in a power move, and it caused a lot of hardship at the time. And a lot of animosity at the time. But here they were back again, together, in life together, as this time as father and son. There was animosity again, but they reconciled it. They found healing, and they honored each other's work. And Hughlin spent his life honoring the Edgar Cayce work after having had this lifetime before where they had been rivals and he had used his power against Edgar Cayce. So I think that this is an example of how patience can give us the sense that even if conflicts don't get resolved in one lifetime, they can get resolved over many lifetimes. And we can remember that there can be a not yet, but we can know that there's going to be opportunities ahead. If we can't get a conflict resolved in this lifetime, we can still try, but we can also hope that there can be a better life an opportunity to reconcile, even if we didn't see success in this lifetime. And here's another example. His other son, Edgar Evans, was there's no reading about them having had a life together, but there was some concerns in this very reading that Edgar Evans had in his very early days. He was very young, but they gave him a life reading, and they said he'd had this lifetime in Atlantis where he had been the person who had brought to the world the knowledge about how to use chemicals together to make chemical explosives and the technology of bomb making, basically. And it said that he was someone in many spheres would dread his coming back to Earth. So, but this is someone again who, had a very favorable life, and who supported his family, did great work, was very smart and capable, and a great Cayce researcher who also gave a lot of his life to the work and to honoring the work that Cayce was doing. And so again, here's someone who had someone who had been seen as the villain perhaps in a past life many lifetimes ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, but who came back and who was able to transform and not be in the role of the villain, who was then in the role of a wonderful contributor to the current day. So there are lessons in patience that we can keep in our minds, that conflict resolution can take place over many lifetimes. Well, putting it all together, I think that, one of my perspectives that I can share with you here is that conflict is something we can see as a part of our lives. There's a great author I admire named Robert McKee, who's one of the best thinkers about how stories get told. He's a counselor to screenwriters and novelists, and he just says he makes the point, nothing moves forward in a story except through conflict. So conflict is a part of moving our stories forward. And the point that Robert McKee makes, which I think I like a lot, he just says, true character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, the truer the choice to the character's essential nature. So the more we stay ready to stay grounded in our spiritual nature and our spiritual ideals, we can see how that gets revealed when pressures or conflicts come our way. And it will show us who we really are. How will you write the story of your conflict as you look back on it? You can think about those storytelling elements, but conflict can be conflict and conflict resolution can be an important part of our spiritual journey as well as our life journey. And Edgar Cayce just again reminded us that how we interact with others, how we interact in our relationships with our fellow man, is how we consider our relationship to our maker. So we're reflecting what we think of our maker when we interact with others. I just had to close with this. This is an example of the humor in the readings, but this businessman came into Edgar Cayce one time and was concerned about some things going on in his business. And he asked the question this way. He said, will the body find himself in a lawsuit? He's worried about conflict. And the answer comes through from the reading with this. The body may find himself in any way. Best to find himself from within rather than in a lawsuit. So I think that that's a little message to us, but he's also reminding us that conflict is a part of our accomplishments too, and seeing how we act in the times of conflict is a part of our life. Has he an enemy through the business? Who has accomplished anything without enemies? So I think about the wisdom teachers that have been through the years, great people, Martin Luther King, so many others who made enemies, but they accomplished a lot because they leaned into conflict, and they embraced their tools that they had from a practical standpoint, from dealing with the emotions around conflict and dealing with their spiritual path around conflict. And I just close with this. Edgar Cayce said, whatever your problems, whatever your conflicts that come into your life, take it to him. No problem is too small to take to God. I started out with a picture of two bulls engaged with each other, but I think I'm hoping that your takeaway from our time together is to think about the ways that you can embrace your powers, your conflict resolution toolbox, and embrace those powers that you have to move forward and see what spiritual how you can have conflict be a part of your spiritual journey rather than something that's outside it. So I'm very open to answering questions and having you stay in touch with me after the session is over as well. There's my contact information. I'm happy to answer questions.